All right, everybody, we'll be getting started here in just literally 1 minute. So if you have any last minute things to take care of, we'll be starting and looking forward to having a great webinar.
I was asking a question, but that wasn't. It's 90 minutes, right? The webinar? 90 minutes?
90, yes. All right, everybody, I think it's about time for us to get started. I've tried to give every a little bit of a last minute late comers are still appreciated, but we need to get started. Just want to thank everybody for joining us here at the International Water Resources Association webinar. As you know, this is, or you may know, this is one of a series of webinars we've done. We've done about 6 or 7 of them now. And these are all based off the special issues of our flagship publication, Water International. So these presenters have all worked on the articles and the editing the special issue. And so our presenters largely come from academia, and they hold expert level opinions and ideas, and have done a great deal of research on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and its impacts, particularly in water governance. So we're very excited to have you here today and to share this interesting and informative webinar with us. The International Water Resources Association is a nonprofit, non-governmental educational organization that's over 40 years old. We focus on bridging disciplines and geographies and connecting professionals, students, individuals, corporations, and institutions who are concerned with the sustainable use of the world's water resources. Today we have a group including Zeray Yihdego, Anna Carrasco, Kevin Wheeler, and Jasmine Moussa. Unfortunately, one of our panelists fell sick, so he won't be joining us, but we will have a great panel all the same. Today, just to kind of briefly go over this, in case a few of you haven't joined us before, what we're going to do is start with each of our panelists giving a short presentation of around 10 minutes. This will include PowerPoint, so you can kind of follow along. And then the majority of the time after that will be saved for questions from the audience. You can see in your GoToWebinar control panel about halfway down, it says questions. You click there and type your question. I will see it, and then at the appropriate time, I will be able to direct it to either the panel as a whole, or if you have a specific question engaging certain parts of a presentation you see, please make sure you note that, and I'll be able to direct it directly to, or perhaps combine a couple of questions similarly to our panelists. So that provides us a good way to kind of share and communicate about these issues. A few of you already actually sent in questions, so I've got those written down, and we'll get to them. And then at the end, we'll probably just have a short summary from everybody if there's any last minute thoughts. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Zeray Yihdego. Zeray, I'll make you a presenter here, and you can show us your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. I'd like to Well, thank you very much, Scott. I would like to welcome everyone on behalf of myself and the other guest editors of the special issue, Professor Rieu-Clarke and Dr. Cascao. Thank you also for everyone for joining us this morning. What am I going to do in the next couple of minutes is to summarize the key aspects of the editorial that we have written on the special issue, and I would like to focus on three aspects. Why the special issue, and what was the main question that we addressed in the special issue. And the second one is just to briefly talk about the articles and the nature of the articles, the nature of the contributors in general, and the setting or the main founding factual and legal and scientific issues. And then at the third level, I'll talk about the key findings and perspectives, and I'll conclude with some remarks. So why the special issue on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam? Well, obviously, it was intended to look into the opportunities and challenges that the GERD brought to the region, to the sub-region, and to the scholars in general. And we intended to do so by addressing the issues surrounding the GERD from multidisciplinary perspective, from different disciplines perspective. So this was the main intention, and the second one was obviously to foster an informed scholarly debate and discussion on the subject, with the aim of influencing policymakers to come up with reasonable and equitable use of Nile waters, and also to address some issues of significant harm towards each other. The third one was to highlight the fact that upstream countries such as Ethiopia and Sudan need to tackle their severe energy demands, including elevation poverty on the one hand, and the need for preventing significant harm on Egypt and to some extent Sudan as well. So it was a question of finding a middle ground, finding options, approaches to strike a balance between and among the different interests at stake. And the central question, the special issue tried to address, was to look into the ways in which the GERD changes the dynamics in the Nile basin. So this was the core question that the special issue tried to address. So very briefly about the nature of the special issue. Obviously, it goes back to the 25th World Water Congress held in Edinburgh in 2015, and this World Congress is normally organized by the International Water Resources Association. And during this special issue, during this World Water Congress, we organized a special session on the GERD, and most of the papers published in this special issue were byproducts of this special discussion. However, they were reinforced by other papers from renowned experts. So it's a combination of that event and additional papers by experts in the field. And the special issue attracted about 19 experts. So it is a byproduct of 19 lawyers, hydrology experts, political scientists, and the likes. And all papers were rigorously reviewed, some of them by 4 external anonymous reviewers. So I would say that the publications are of high quality. Well, just to give you some brief description of the nature of the articles, there are 3 law articles that dealt with the GERD and water in the region in general. One of them dealt with the current developments, the Declaration of Principles, and the Khartoum document by Salman. And the second one was an endeavor to apply the principle of fairness to the GERD and to the Nile issue in general, and it was authored by myself and Professor Rieu-Clarke. And the third one was authored by Dr. Nanni, and it was about the IGAD efforts to come up with some legal framework in the IGAD region on the subject of water. There are also two political science articles, so hydro policy, hydro diplomacy articles authored by Dr. Cascao and her colleague, and also by Dr. Tawfik on the dynamics of hydropolitics in the region with respect to the GERD in particular. And the other two technical articles are about the filling of the dam. The first one deals with how we should fill the dam by looking into the interests of both upstream and downstream countries. And it focuses on the flow of water from the dam itself, while the second technical paper focuses on an integrated approach to filling, as you would be able to hear from the main author of the piece. So this describes, I believe, the nature of or the overview of the special issue. With this, I will now identify about 5 key findings of the special issue, and I'll go through these points very briefly. And the first finding, or the key finding of the special issue, is to do with the fact that the GERD brought a new area of cooperation in the Eastern Nile Basin, and most, if not all, contributors have agreed that this brought the GERD and the subsequent developments brought a new dynamics and cooperation, a new area of cooperation among Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan. And this was expressed in terms of terms such as the GERD and subsequent developments as a game changer, as a fair system, and also as a new legal order, as stated by Salman. So all this indicate, to say the least, that the GERD brought a new era of cooperation in the Nile Basin. So this is one of the key perspectives that one can identify from the special issue. However, this can be challenged. This core finding can be challenged on the basis that these developments does not make very clear as to the status of old treaties, Nile treaties. As we all know, we have colonial treaties on the Nile, and the Declaration of Principles and subsequent agreements or undertakings do not make it very clear as to whether these new engagements and principles supersede the new legal regime, or whether they go side by side. So it's a difficult question. And secondly, it may also be said that the GERD and the subsequent developments are not new, because we had post-1919 developments such as the MBI and the Cooperative Framework Agreement. However, what is clear is that the Declaration of Principles in particular can be seen as a major breakthrough, because it has broken the deadlock of negotiations and processes in the Nile Basin, and in that respect, it can still be maintained that this is a new era. This is a new level of cooperation in the Nile Basin. So this is one. The second one is that the GERD and subsequent developments are connected with global developments, and they may have global connotations. And this is reinforced by the fact that the GERD and the Declaration of Principles, the GERD, which was followed by the adoption of the Declaration of Principles, was followed by the entry into force of the United Nations Convention on Watercourses, 1997. The Declaration of Principles basically endorsed the basic principles and rules that are enshrined in the United Nations Watercourses Convention. And also, we have to recognize that the Sustainable Development Goals that are adopted in 2015 also recognize the commitment to integrate water resources management at a transboundary level. And we thought that this might encourage Nile Basin countries to cooperate at the basin level and even at the global level, and vice versa. The third key finding is that the GERD have the potential to foster shared benefit among Nile Basin countries, in particular Eastern Nile Basin countries. And it can also serve as a driver for integration in the region. So most articles stress the fact that GERD is as an opportunity to sharing the benefits of the project, and also going beyond them to promote integration on trade matters, investment matters, and so on among the three countries and beyond. Of course, some of the papers have highlighted questions of environment and downstream impacts of the GERD, and this remains to be divisive, and the three countries, as we all know, agreed to carry out studies, which is marred by delays as a matter of political and administrative and technical issues. And I'm sure some of the presenters will flag out these challenges. And also, given that the GERD is a national project, which is operated and which is under construction by Ethiopia, applying the concept of benefit sharing might not necessarily be guaranteed. It must be subject to negotiations, continued negotiations and compromises. But nevertheless, if the countries work very hard to address these challenges, including the question of finding a common ground to fill the dam, and also to cooperate on its operations, subsequent operations. There is a consensus among most contributors that the GERD can still serve as a driver of basin-level cooperation, and it might also contribute to the strengthening of the Nile Basin Initiative and the SVA, and therefore become a catalyst for further cooperation and integration in the Nile Basin. The fourth key conclusion is that the three countries must work very seriously to deal with the dam filling and the GERD filling. The key message that you find from the special issues that a negotiated and compromise needs to be established to minimize the harm that Sudan and Egypt may sustain out of the filling of the dam, but without affecting or compromising on a reasonable and timely filling for best utilization of the GERD. So the two technical articles try to find a common ground or a middle ground as far as filling is concerned. And finally, a number of articles stress the fact that the negotiations must be transparent, must be participatory. So concerned communities, scholars, citizens, and even regional organizations such as IGAD and the Nile Basin Initiative must take part in the debate, in the negotiations, in informing policy and the decision making in general. And this is very important for making an informed and widely accepted decision making process. So from this, we can say that the special issue strongly recommend this basin-wide approach and cooperation to this issue, using the GERD as a basis. And also, the GERD must serve as a basis for wider integration issues rather than more than water share or sharing the benefits of the dam itself. And secondly, and clearly, the dam brought dynamics in many ways, in scientific and political and legal terms, and this must be maintained and take further to promote cooperation among Nile Basin countries. Of course, all these are not without challenges. There are challenges, but if countries of the basin and the sub-basin in particular resolve the challenges on the basis of science and the basis of an informed policy-making process and cooperation, we believe that all will benefit out of the GERD and subsequent developments. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that presentation. I thought that was an excellent summary and overview of not just the special issue of Water International, which you were an editor of, and gave us all a good idea of what articles are in there and what topics and areas are discussed, policy, technical, legal, social, but also gave us a good introduction and framework to understand how we'll have a discussion about this critical issue and this very timely issue and this controversial issue. So, Zeray, thank you for that presentation. That was really engaging, and thank you. Our next presenter will be Anna Kraso. Let me just make you a presenter. And there we go.
It's full screen now?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, thank you, Scott, for leading us. Thank you, Zeray, for the introduction. I think it's a very good summary of all the great contributions that we had in the special issue. And I mean, perhaps I would like to highlight that we don't all have to agree on the main conclusions, and we also don't necessarily need to agree how the process has started. And actually, my presentation is actually related to the cooperation process, which Zeray was highlighting. I know Kevin and Jasmine, they will be talking about that before, because it's quite a concept. It's a concept being used quite often, and what does necessarily mean. So my question, which is also based on the article that was published in the special issue, if the group is actually bringing new norms of cooperation in the Nile Basin, because we know that there has been already something before and there will be something after, but what does it mean in terms of cooperation between the different riparians? So perhaps I would like to start with the initial question, because we see very often in the literature that the GERD, the Grand Renaissance Dam, comes as a catalyst of change, that a lot of things are changing after this large-scale project comes, or it is already, but when it becomes a reality once it's filled and full operating. But I would say that perhaps, and not just for analytical purpose, but also to understand how the cooperation process can deal with the current situation, is that it's also an outcome of change. So the GERD doesn't appear out of the blues. It comes in the continuation of a long political process. We know very well that in the past there's been a number of issues between the countries, which are not just legal, are technical as well, and are political above all, and we should not run away from discussing this kind of issues. So I would say that the GERD is an outcome of shifting and complex regional hydropolitical process that were going on the region, at least for the last 20 years. So let's say from the beginning of the 90s. And if we understand the GERD as a process of change that was going on, so it's an outcome and not only a tipping point, what we can observe, and those of us, sorry, I lost my own file, just trying to close this. And if we see what was going on in the region, at least since the 90s, is that there was a set of new and unprecedented economic, social, political, and hydropolitical dynamics in the region. And those of us that have been studying the Nile for quite a long time, we know that this was bound to bring some changes in the region. And the structural changes in the political economy at the national, regional, and global level. We have to understand the Nile region as a very important, geopolitically speaking, region that has importance and interest for many actors around the world. And it's not just about the Nile, of course, it's many other geopolitical and geostrategic importance. We would say that, I mean, we could obviously just analyze how the key structural changes in Ethiopia, in the political economy of Ethiopia, be it the economic growth, the political stability that there was not there in the first place, and that it came gradually through the 90s, were a key driver to the GERD. Also, the increasing demands for energy in particular, for hydropower, even more particular. But we would say that the internal changes in Sudan and Egypt were equally important factors for the GERD to come about. And we would ask why. We know that Sudan has been going through a transformational process with the separation of South Sudan, but also in economic terms with a new agenda for agriculture development, for increasing agricultural development. And we know that the situation in Egypt, internal politics, has changed quite a lot since the so-called Arab Revolution that took place in January, or started in January 2011. So all this comes as factors that explains partially why the GERD came to exist, at least when it was announced in April 2011. But I would argue, and the article is all about this, that it's more than that, that the GERD comes as an outcome in the process of cooperation, and norms that were being established since the 90s. So we would look at the multilateral process that is going on, the Nile Basin Initiative established in 1999 and with this shared vision, but as well, or more particularly, if we look at the Eastern Nile, where the GERD is located, all the investment projects that were being planned by the three countries. I mean, the three countries were part of an institution making use of the idea of subsidiarity, that the decision should be taken at the lowest level, and they were identifying the projects together. There was a whole setting of regional tools, let's call it that way, of negotiations to decide where and when it's best to develop the shared water resources, knowing that, of course, the goal is to maximize the potential and the benefits, but as well to minimize the risks. And doing it together might take a long time, but perhaps it sets the right stage for people to cooperate. Well, due to a lot of different political reasons, in particular the ones related with the cooperative framework agreements, CFA negotiations, and later its signature, somehow this process has been, let's say, disrupted. I'm not going into the legal issues because we have quite a number of international lawyers that are in much better conditions to talk about this, but I mean, I take it as a factor that has contributed for the multilateral process to somehow do not deliver the benefits as it was expected. In any case, what we can say is that the multilateral cooperation process has contributed to change the status quo in the basin. So when we talk about the status quo, a past situation where there was a certain number of things in place that were taken for granted as change in result, as a result of the multilateral cooperation process. Perhaps I jumped this one. The discussion on the GERD as an outcome of change is like saying, so, but what am I trying to say? That a multilateral cooperation process that was going into the right direction, identifying regional projects with regional benefits, with a comprehensive framework agreement that was not signed by all, but still was being negotiations, as actually the outcome of it is a large-scale dam, which is a national, unilateral, if you want, project. Well, I would say yes, in two different ways. One has an outcome of failed expectations, or perhaps too much ambitious expectations regarding the multilateral process. When the countries have started to cooperate, we can assume that the upstream countries, those that still have that still have a lot to develop, that they have a lot of potential that has not been developed in the last century, they were extremely ambitious, thinking that the multilateral cooperation process could deliver all this infrastructure, and we are talking about investment in infrastructure. And this didn't materialize. Of course, that the multilateral cooperation process, the NBI, has delivered some fast tracks and small-scale projects. It has delivered quite a lot that we can say it was successful, but not on the eyes of countries like Ethiopia that were expecting, if nothing else, but at least the development of hydropower or agriculture projects. So this is one of the reasons. At the light of failed or process that were lingering for too long, the decision of Ethiopia of moving ahead with a national project. And perhaps just a bit like between the brackets, not this project specifically, but under the GMP, which was actually my previous slide, the joint multipurpose project that was a project involving both Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. It was being studied, the development of 4 large-scale dams in the Blue Nile, in result of the scoping study done by external consultants, that these projects altogether, of course, there would be a sequence, could deliver all these regional benefits. Not just they would be multi-purpose and large-scale, but they would deliver according to the so-called benefit-sharing type of agreements that, for example, if we read the document, the article of Rieu Taufik in the same special issue, shows that, I mean, this is a concept that yet needs to be materialized and even quantified. This is not an easy thing, and perhaps the GERD offers the opportunity to have a project with very specific characteristics that helps to show who gets what, where, and when. And I think this might be part of the discussion of the presentation of Kevin that shows exactly how these benefits can be perhaps make it bigger in case that there is cooperation between the countries. Second point on the discussion of the GERD as an outcome of change is that there has been a change in the regional power balance, or balance of power, and decreasing asymmetries in the Nile basin. I mean, this is not all about saying that the upstream countries got stronger at the expenses of the downstream countries. This is not what it is about. But what we in the article are trying to say is that the fact that in the 20 years the countries have been cooperating, out of it, I mean, there's indirect and perhaps unintended consequences of it. The upstream countries have become or have been provided with additional power that they didn't have in previous negotiations with the downstream countries that have been the main users for a long period of time. They had increasing knowledge on the development of opportunities, improved capacity to influence the dialogue, the agenda setting, the negotiations, the policy formulation. So, and we could see that this was translated in Ethiopia, but also the other upstream countries, stronger bargaining power in the negotiations with the downstream riparians, be it at the multilateral level or at the trilateral level. And this is what is my next point, is that now when we observe the process, I mean, once the GERD was announced and it was taken as something that Ethiopia would move in a way or another, what we could see is that what started as a national and unilateral project, as soon, and what I'm saying soon is basically in the same few months, a couple of months after that, that ad hoc trilateral talks led to first technical negotiations and later on to political negotiations, and we ended up in a long process, by the way, from 2011 till 2015 to a new agreed trilateral framework which was signed by the heads of states of the three countries. I mean, if we would look back, I mean, 10 years ago, this would look quite an impossible scenario. So we must ask questions that say, why did it work? Is it because it's at the trilateral level? Is it because the GERD became a fact on the ground and countries are obliged to negotiate? I mean, it's impossible for the downstream countries, of course, because they want to minimize the risks and protect their own rights granted by the agreements that they have themselves signed. But we could say that even for Ethiopia, I mean, the country that has started developing the project, there is a need to have a talks with these three countries, not just because of goodwill, but because there is no way of operating such a large-scale infrastructure without talking to the neighbors. So I would say that it's good news on a way, perhaps, again, an unintended process, but we do have an agreement signed and endorsed, we can say, although I like the legal issues for the lawyers themselves. But the question now, and how does this influence the cooperation process that countries are already involved? Because what we can see now is that there is many different tracks of cooperation. Countries are cooperating in the NBI and in ENTRO for the Eastern Nile part of the basin, but they are also cooperating in other platforms like IGAD or COMESA or bilateral agreements that the countries have themselves. So how can this make a puzzle, and always thinking that at the end of the day the goal is effective water management? How do we see the different future scenarios? So, and what we are arguing in this article is that actually the GERD process, not the GERD dam as per se, but the process can be a shaper of future development and cooperation. And yes, for the moment, the trilateral and multilateral process can still coexist. I mean, we observe that in many different river basins around the world, but perhaps this might not work in the long term. I mean, perhaps the countries need to take this opportunity to think that there is a need to have norms and agreements and institutions with multilateral scope that can prevent this process to go on again. I mean, being negotiating for every single infrastructures that will come in the future. And this is my last slide. So basically what I would say in terms of GERD as a shaper of future, and this goes back to my question at the beginning. So the GERD is an outcome of change and is a catalyst of further change. But emerging different relations between the three countries, at least, increasing understanding of the tangible economic benefits. Looks like now it's easier. I mean, it's not anymore an abstract conversation about benefits, but now we know how much megawatts, let's put it that way, are being produced, who is going to pay, who is going to buy, who is going to trade. The same could be said that water for irrigation purpose or for agriculture purpose, once again, is more possible to quantify and more possible to do trade-offs between the countries. I think there is an awareness of the need to comprehensive agreements to minimize risks, and I think this is, or I like to believe that this comes as a call to the downstream riparians to think that perhaps there is a need to go beyond the agreements that exist at the moment. Well, maybe the conclusion is a very self-evident one, but that cooperation is desirable, but it's possible. I mean, even in the circumstances that we have seen, and we know, those of us that have been studying the GERD from the very beginning of, since its inception, let's call it that way, that it was not an easy process, but it became possible. So if it's possible in the GERD, it should be possible at a more, let's say, inclusive level, including all the countries. So all in all, and perhaps I conclude, I think my time it's soon over, is that the GERD process provides a strategic opportunity for the countries to reflect on the pressing need for a new transboundary water regime in the Nile Basin. What does it mean and what shape it will take? I let for the next speakers to provide us some light. Thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate that presentation. That was great. A lot of times, what I've read involves a lot of colonial era treaties, and then more recently, sort of the impacts of building the dam. But I like by focusing on the idea of processes, you're able to sort of dig through a history of the more recent past, which sort of brings us to where the dam is now, and sort of highlights these not just social and not just legal, but sort of the social political processes that have led us to where we are now, and then to where we're going in the future. That's great. That was fascinating. Well, I hope that our next presenters can build from there and sort of highlight different aspects of where the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is going. Our next presenter is Kevin Wheeler. Let me just make you a presenter. And
okay, can everybody hear me? There we go. Is my microphone on here?
Yep, you sound great.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail on the technical aspects of it, engineering background, but I'm going to look specifically at the filling strategies and what some potential pathways are based on some work I've been doing throughout the last 5 years or so. And it's a large collaboration of several different people. Okay, I'm going to talk about just the rationale behind why we did this, some of the methods, some of the results, and then propose some possible ways forward. Okay, I always like to start out with just some of the basic hydrology, and just to sum up really quick, about 30% of the water comes from the White Nile that flows into the Aswan, about 57% comes from the Blue Nile, and 13% comes from the Abara, for the 100% flow into Lake Nasser. And so about 53% overall comes above the GERD. So we can roughly say half of the water that goes in the Aswan Dam flows through the GERD location. So it's not all of it, but it's about half. Okay, so the rationale for the study. This is an independent study, not funded by anybody really. The origins originally were intro and building an initial model, but for the last several years it's been constructed independently with no input from any of the governments financially at all. It's purely independent, just a lot of intellectual support. Collaborative, working between all the different countries and a lot of different partners on this. It's an unofficial study, so obviously there's a current ongoing official study going on. So there's no authority over the study at all. It's simply an academic concept, and really our focus is to bring in probabilistic impacts, turn it to more of a risk-based analysis, and able to explore creative solutions where we maximize benefits and minimize risks. So it's really based on the idea that cooperation and coordination is not binary. It doesn't start from yes or no. It's really a continuum. And its paper by Sedzioff and Gray really highlighted this, from unilateral action to full integration. There's a continuum on development projects, but also on reservoir operations. How they're operated can also be done in many different ways. So a couple truisms now. Risks always do exist, no matter what. Cooperation, non-cooperation certainly can increase risk, where cooperation can decrease risk without a doubt. And risks are certainly best managed together, and those are shown throughout this study. Okay, so some of the methods. So since 2012, working 3 countries and in South Sudan as well a little bit, over 20 visits, 7 different training sessions on the modeling tools, A lot of stakeholder participation and data collection in each of the different dam sites has gone on. So a lot of contributions to this over a period of time. So the goal is to develop a hydropolicy model, and I define this by having sufficient accuracy to capture the major processes, having sufficient transparency so stakeholders can understand and use the model, and enough flexibility, especially in a negotiation context, to be able to try different things and meet some of the proposed policy changes. And really, a well-designed model can support negotiations if they're done in a very well-designed way. Okay, so here's what the schematic would look like, and all the major reservoirs are included, and major diversions or aggregate diversions. And we can see towards the bottom here, it does not include the equatorial lakes area. So really just focusing on the eastern Nile region, but has all of the major operations for all the major dams and reservoirs. Okay, so hydrology, one of the traditional methods that you see oftentimes used, where they use a wet, an average, or a dry hydrology, considered dry on record. Now, we tend to consider this as insufficient. It's a very selection of which hydrologies to use can be subject to a selection bias for sure. A much better way that we emphasize here is using multiple scenarios, or more of a risk-based analysis. One way of doing this is called an index sequential method. And another way is various methods of generated synthetic hydrology, which one of the other papers in the special issue did focus on a little bit more. But really, we focused on this index sequential method, where we use all different points in history as potential futures. Okay, the basis of the hydrology is monthly reconstructed flows from 1900 to 2002, so a 103-year record, and this was done by Del Taris in 2012 under a consultancy for Intro. Under the demands, the assumptions being used is Ethiopia uses essentially 0, Sudan uses 16.0 billion cubic meters, and Egypt 55.5 billion cubic meters. Now, lots of debate on how these numbers, or what the actual numbers are, and I won't get into that. We can talk about that later if we want, but these are the assumptions that were embedded into the model. Now, the major assumption is these remain unchanged throughout the filling period, which I think is a fairly good assumption that should be considered pretty seriously during this critical time. Okay, so here's a cross-section of the dam, and a lot of these figures are in the paper. And just to show here, there's some of the lower inlets for the turbines, and within the first year, it'll collect about 3 billion cubic meters. Now, on average, there's about 50 billion cubic meters that pass through the site every year, on average. So this first year, we'll capture a small portion of that, just to test out the turbines. Then after that, an additional 7 billion cubic meters to get it to the minimum operating level. And above that, about another 59 billion cubic meters to the full supply level. So this lower part, once it's filled, will be about 15 billion cubic meters, and that's considered the dead storage. And after that, the reservoir will really oscillate within this active storage area, 59 billion cubic meters. Okay, so imagine this. They're coming into Ethiopia, passing through without a reservoir, through a border, and then through the different cascades of reservoirs in Sudan, the Meroe, the Sennar, and Rosaris, where water gets diverted off to the Zeray scheme, and remaining water, and then water comes in obviously from the Blue Nile, and the remaining water goes into Egypt, where it generates electricity as well as supplies Cairo and the agriculture in Egypt. So the question is, when the reservoir in Ethiopia fills, what is the impact downstream? Now, if there's an agreed annual release that Ethiopia says they promise to make downstream, an agreement between the different countries, that will help mitigate some of the potential impacts downstream. Obviously, the initial reservoir elevation of the High Aswan Dam is a critical piece of information, how much water sits in that reservoir when the filling begins. Another factor is how Egypt will manage its reservoir as a response to the existence of the GERD, and how Sudan will operate their reservoirs as a response to the GERD as well. So many different factors are at play here. But if an agreed annual release can be agreed upon, we can consider that a good basic level of coordination that the Nile hasn't seen before. from a technical perspective. So that's an excellent step forward, but we're also going to look at what are the continued benefits and risks of this. Okay, so the different dimensions to evaluate. An agreed annual release from the GERD, what the starting elevation of the Aswan Dam is, what the operations of the Aswan Dam could be, and what the operations of the Sudanese reservoirs are. So many different factors to evaluate, and this is why you use a model, because really it's kind of impossible to understand these without some technical understanding. Okay, so what's some of the key results? So depending on the different agreed annual releases and the different hydrologies, there's a distribution of how many years it may take to fill the reservoir. So without any agreement, essentially 0 billion cubic meters agreed and released, it could fill within a very quick period of time, 3 years. Thereafter, as that agreed annual release increases, the duration to fill could increase as well. So the center point being the median, and this is the distribution in a box and whisker type plot. So obviously, if you get to these larger areas, it may on average be 7 or 8, but it could be as large as 20, which may be unacceptable to Ethiopia. So this gives us a distribution. Okay, the average energy generation across the different countries. So let's look at this. Now, under the short term, which is the first 10 years, and the medium term, which is the next 20 years, we can see the benefits to Ethiopia energy generation, about 10.3 to 14 thousand gigawatt hours per year is the energy generation. Now, it will also benefit Sudan. They'll be able to operate their reservoirs more efficiently as well. We call that an uplift effect. But there'll also be a negative effect on Egypt. And we know that their reservoirs will drop a certain amount during this time and will result in lower energy generation. But this helps us give us an idea of the magnitude benefits versus the magnitude of costs across the basin. So it's significant benefits and some more minor costs there, but gives us an idea of the magnitude differences. Okay, so what about shortages? And I'm going to focus mainly on Egypt here, and we can talk about Sudan later, but the shortages to Egypt, on average, if you took all the hydrologies together, it's going to depend both on the starting elevation of the Aswan Dam, so whether it starts at very full at 180 meters high, versus 175, 170, or 165, and depend on what the agreed annual release is of these as well. And so these show that under different scenarios, the expected shortages to Egypt could potentially exist, and different magnitudes depending on those situations. So again, this is averaged across all the hydrologies. Now, this still isn't a good way to look at it because we don't really know what the shortages are. So let's take one of our examples. The High Aswan Dam starts at 175 meters. Okay, so these plots within the paper, these describe the percent exceedance and a shortage to Egyptian water users, and taken over a time window of 2016 to 2025, so the first 10 years. So what this really shows is that there is, on average, so 50%, there's really no shortages. However, there is a small probability of potentially large shortages. And this is why we need to change the thinking to a much more probabilistic thinking. So on average hydrology, there is no shortage because the storage within the Aswan Dam can take care of it. However, there's a low probability of a potentially very large shortage. So you can see, with Egypt using 55.5 billion cubic meters, some of the hydrologies even shortages extremely high, but a very low probability. So this is why it's very critical to not think in terms of simplistic harm and no harm, but really think what is the probabilities of shortages and what are the potential magnitudes. Okay, and really begs the question, what is an acceptable risk? Always a risk. There's a risk today, even before the GERD, that there could be shortages in Egypt, but what is an acceptable risk? And we have to think in terms of and engineers are very used to thinking in these sort of terms. Okay, so this is not equal to the maximum annual risk, some statistical reasons, but a better way to look at this is we're going to look at the elevation of the Aswan Dam. So the Aswan Dam operates between its full level at 182 meters and its bottom level at 147 meters. So when there's a shortage, Okay, so this is the critical area. If this is the historical of elevations, and if the elevation falls below this minimum operating level, two things have to happen, or one of two things. Either the turbines have to shut down or there's unplanned reductions. So this is that going into that dead zone in a reservoir, and you want to avoid this at all costs. And it's in the best interest of everybody to avoid this from happening. Okay, so if the reservoir starts to fall, that's when you have the potential shortages. So we can look at what is the probability of reaching this bottom level, the 147 meters, under the different scenarios. Okay, so if the Aswan Dam starts very full, what's the probability of it falling lower depending on an agreed annual release? So it can be anywhere without any additional coordination other than an agreed annual release. This is the probability of it still falling down low. So there is still a possibility that it could get down to that bottom number. Now, obviously, as the initial reservoir elevation decreases, those numbers are going to increase. Okay? 170 meters, then 165 meters, and potentially we're getting to higher probabilities of reaching that bottom level. So this should cause some concern of what is an acceptable risk. Okay, so this is what really brings us to some more better thinking in terms of working together, real compromise and real cooperation. Okay, so first off, we know that that Egypt also they have their own drought management plan in place. So as that reservoir level falls, they would actually potentially decrease the deliveries downstream. So below a certain level, they would decrease it potentially by 5%, by 10%, by 15% of their releases downstream to try to avoid hitting this bottom level of 147 meters. So by doing that, what we're doing is we're avoiding that probability. We're trying to reduce that amount. So with that drought management plan, if they voluntarily reduce their deliveries, they could avoid hitting that lower level by a little bit. And again, it doesn't totally alleviate the problems. There's still some high possibilities in there, or there's still some probability of reaching the bottom level, but it does improve it. Now, we still can work much better to be able to protect Egypt if the countries work together. Okay, so let's imagine this. In this scenario, imagine the reservoir level of Egypt gets too low. Now, Ethiopia can respond. Now, what if we decided to put a minimum elevation of Egypt of 150 meters, and Ethiopia uses the storage they've accumulated to make sure that Egypt doesn't reach those critical levels? So remember, 147 is the critical level. Maybe 150 meters provides a bit of a buffer, and they make an additional release that cascades through, or that passes through Sudan. So Sudan has to agree, and additional water goes to Egypt to guarantee that level. That's why you have a reservoir upstream, is to protect downstream. So keep that water above 150 at all times would be an agreement. So this is an increased level of cooperation. Use the GERD to back up the High Aswan Dam. And this requires a much more refined, much more continuous coordination between the reservoirs. But by doing this, you can really reduce the risks to Egypt. Okay. An agreed annual release plus using the GERD to back up the High Aswan Dam requires open data sharing. Requires agreements from all three countries to be able to do this. Real cooperation on the ground. Okay, so what does this look like? This is a basic level of coordination, like we said, and basic level of coordination with the drought management plan. If you just introduced a continuous coordination with no drought management plan, there's still probabilities of it reaching the shortages, reaching that minimum level. However, a combination of all of these pieces really can minimize the risks to Egypt. And I think that's in the best interest of everybody to avoid hitting that bottom level. So this is really the take-home story of the more cooperation that exists. Technically, the risks can be minimized if not eliminated. And of course, there always can be some risks, and we can talk about the details of that. But depending on what those trigger levels are, how they release that water, we can really manage this risk down to zero if the countries are willing to compromise and work together. And back to some of these plots. we can see that we end up redistributing some of this high-level risk down to a lower and more acceptable risk of shortages. So we're going to leave it at that. So some of the summary. So it's a shift from binary thinking. It's not just about harm versus no harm to really risk-based thinking. There is a low risk on average. If you just look at average hydrology, it's a low risk. However, there are some probability of significant impacts. So the big critical question, what is a tolerable risk? In the basin, the countries really need to talk about this, this critical issue. What is a tolerable risk? There is a very strong argument for cooperative agreements between the countries. The impacts will be highly dependent upon the agreements that are reached. There will be significant basin-wide long-term benefits if the countries especially can come to agreements. Risks do exist, but the impacts are completely manageable if the countries can come to an agreement. And information sharing arrangements are critical to making these happen. I can't emphasize that enough, how important sharing information is. So that's all. Concludes my talk, and pass it on.
Well, thank you for that. That was great. I think a lot of the policy-related discussions I've read lack that technical side, and by bringing through a lot of the numbers, which at times can be a little difficult to follow, admittedly, but by laying it out like that, I think that we all sort of got a better idea of exactly how those risks can be managed and how important that data sharing will be, which is built into these agreements. Our final presenter is Jasmine Moussa, and let me make you a panel presenter. There we go.
Hello?
Hello.
Hello? Can you see my screen?
Yes, everything looks great.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you for all the panelists. I think there's a lot of food for thought there, and it's really interesting to see the different perspectives. So before I start, I just want to make a little introduction about the title of the panel today, because I had mentioned that I thought it would be appropriate to put a little question mark when we talk about a catalyst for change. And the reason I suggested that is I thought that there are a lot of different perspectives when it comes to this issue, and there is quite a bit of controversy surrounding the GERD. So I think we really need to kind of capture that there is no absolute consensus on what the impacts of the GERD are and how this process is being managed. Having said that, I think I would like to absolutely agree with what has been said, that it is absolutely essential to cooperate. And cooperation is a good thing. However, I'd like to emphasize that while there is, as the previous speakers emphasized, there is a process of cooperation that is happening, but at the same time, I think in parallel, there is a process of disregarding the cooperative outcomes. So to what extent are we really putting a weight on this cooperation if at the end of the day the cooperative outcomes are not really being implemented? So what I propose to talk about today is something quite specific. So I'm talking about the legal aspects of the GERD. And there have been already two contributions in the special issue that have talked about this, and I am not one of the people that contributed to the special issue, so I'm kind of talking from a different perspective. I don't want to go into too much detail about the background of the GERD, because I'm sure everyone's already aware of that, and it's been touched upon by the speakers that just spoke. I just want to highlight that the process began in January 2011 when Ethiopia unilaterally began this process, and as Dr. Cascao mentioned, shortly thereafter it became a trilateral process, first ad hoc and then more institutionalized. In May 2013 there was a report that was issued by the International Panel of Experts that was agreed upon through these tripartite consultations, and their report had requested additional studies. based on that, the process was put in place to get these studies commissioned and done, and that the studies should inform the process of construction of the GERD. And in March 2015, there was a very welcome development, as the previous speakers have pointed out. And that welcome development was the signature of the Declaration of Principles on the GERD, Article 5 of which talks about the obligation to respect the outcomes of these studies. So while there has been a process of cooperation, there has been a process of trying to put into place studies that would be carried out by international consultants who are neutral and who are objective, all throughout construction has continued unabated without regard to these studies. So that's an issue that we really need to kind of take into consideration when we consider what we mean by cooperation. Because if cooperation is simply a process that happens on the side while construction is happening unilaterally in parallel, then is that really what I mean by cooperation? And just to emphasize again what it is that I am talking about. So I'm not discussing whether or not Ethiopia has a right in absolute terms to construct a dam upstream. As again, Anna mentioned earlier, there have been previous initiatives and there have been dams that the downstream states have agreed to with Ethiopia. So it's not something new to have a proposal for a dam upstream. What we are really discussing is whether the GERD in its current form or shape, with its current design, with its current size and height and reservoir capacity, whether this achieves the correct balance between Ethiopia's rights and obligations under international law. So if we are to presume, and again, as Zeray mentioned previously, that Ethiopia has the right to develop, to generate electricity, to avoid poverty or to eradicate poverty, but at the same time that has to be balanced against the rights and obligations of other states. And the rights and obligations of other states include the right to use water, whether for domestic agriculture or for power generation or for whatever other uses that are essential. So there are very essential uses of water, particularly, and this is the endless debate between upstream and downstream countries, so I don't want to keep reiterating it, but particularly in a water-scarce region where aridity is really an issue. So some of the arguments that are put forward by some scholars relate to the issue of, relate to the issue of the Declaration of Principles and whether or not it is a binding document or whether it simply provides for a political undertaking. Another argument that is put forward is that a contemporary international law prioritizes equitable and reasonable use over no significant harm, and therefore, essentially, Ethiopia has a right to construct a dam with whatever size and specifications and without regard to existing uses of the water. And then finally, there is the claim that the duty to avoid significant harm does not protect at all existing uses or the future demand for dams and hydropower downstream, particularly in Egypt. And I've put an example from a quote from one of our eminent panelists in one of his papers. He said, minimum water requirements of human beings in downstream countries, that is what the no significant harm principle is supposed to ensure. So these are the kind of arguments that are being put forward. And obviously, the law on this subject is not 100% clear, so there are some vague areas, but there's also some guidelines that can really show us what the rights and obligations of states are. So when we talk about the legal framework that is governing the GERD, again, I'm talking about the GERD specifically. So we have a number of international agreements or treaties, and we have customary international law. So again, these international treaties or agreements, they are contested on the grounds that they are political understandings and they don't produce binding legal obligations. And I want to emphasize again the Declaration of Principles on the GERD of 2015. So it has been argued by many scholars that because this has not been ratified by the Ethiopian Parliament, it's not really a binding international treaty, and also they often invoke provisions of Egypt's constitution relating to ratification. And I just wanted to emphasize that international jurisprudence is very clear on this point. So the International Court of Justice has time and again looked at instruments that are signed in similar circumstances. So for example, in one particular case, the maritime delimitation and territorial questions between Qatar and Bahrain, what was at issue? It was minutes of the meeting signed between the two foreign ministers referring the dispute to the court, and the ICJ said this is a binding international agreement. And they talked about the definition of what is an international treaty or an international agreement. They said no matter what its designation, so it could be called a declaration or a charter or a treaty, it doesn't matter. So the designation is not at all relevant. The second thing is it is concluded or signed by someone who has the authority to do so. So in this case, the Declaration of Principles has been signed by the President of Egypt and Sudan and the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, and they all have the right to bind the state. And the third thing is this instrument, the Declaration of Principles, is silent as to how it enters into force. So it doesn't require ratification for it to enter into force. And the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties basically envisions that in such a situation, an agreement can come into force by signing. So given all of these reasons, it would seem that the Declaration of Principles does create binding legal commitments. Now, there's also a body of customary international law that is applicable. Unfortunately, there won't be time for me to go into this, so I'm going to leave it to talk about it in my presentation this afternoon. And when we talk about, so I talked about the Declaration of Principles, but there's also other treaties that are in force between the parties, and I'll mention them only very briefly at the end. But what we're talking about are substantive obligations and procedural obligations. And these substantive obligations relate to no harm. So there's different thresholds of harm and how do we define harm. Under the Declaration of Principles, we're talking about taking all appropriate measures to avoid significant harm. Other treaties address harm in a different way. Of course, this is balanced against the right of equitable and reasonable use that is mentioned also in the Declaration of Principles. And then there's procedural obligations, and generally procedural obligations relate to prior notification, consultation, preparing an environmental impact assessment, data and information exchange, and so on. The International Court of Justice has said that it is possible for a state to violate its obligations, its procedural obligations under international law without necessarily violating its substantive obligations. So what does that mean? It means that once there is a process in place, this process is supposed to be respected by all of the parties. And even if we have a scenario in which the dam, after it becomes operational, does not actually cause significant harm to either of the downstream states, the fact that Ethiopia did not abide by the procedure that the states agreed to, that in itself can be considered non-compliance with international law and with international obligations. So it's important to keep this in mind. Having said that, I'm very aware of the fact that talking about harm and how simplistic that can sound from a legal perspective is never complete without looking at what the science says. So when we look at studies about how to cooperate in terms of filling the dam and so on, and how to minimize effects downstream, this is extremely important because it allows us to be able to operationalize this term of harm. And what do we mean by avoiding harm? So when states come together to agree on conducting studies in order that these studies can guide them in the construction of the new use, that in and of itself is extremely important, and that is where the cooperation lies. It's not in trying to have a process that is not inclusive, or to have a process that is not based on good faith, or when the interests of one of the parties is completely disregarded. So it is important to keep that in mind. It's important to also keep in mind that the science can always be contested. So there's always scientists that produce one study, and then scientists and technicians that will produce a study with different results. And this has been shown adequately in all of the international cases before courts and tribunals that have dealt with issues relating to water quality and quantity. And it's very difficult to really kind of put your hand on the proper scientific studies and reports. And so having a cooperative process to put that in place is absolutely essential. So when we talk about the Declaration of Principles on the GERD, this basically includes 10 principles. One of those is equitable and reasonable use. It does not include a robust dispute settlement clause, unfortunately, because if it did, then the parties would have been able to resort to a dispute settlement mechanism or some kind of compulsory mechanism to resolve the differences in interpretation. So Principle 3 of the Declaration of Principles states that the 3 states shall take all appropriate measures to prevent the causing of significant harm in utilizing the blue or main Nile. Where significant harm nevertheless is caused to one of the states, then the state whose use causes such harm shall, in the absence of agreement to such use, take all appropriate measures in consultation with the affected state to eliminate or mitigate such harm. So what we can notice from this principle is there's essentially 2 obligations, and this is very similar to the general no harm principle that we find in Article 7 of the UN Watercourses Convention, but it's also different in some respects, so I don't want to generalize. But the 2 obligations are that it's a due diligence obligation, so the states shall take all appropriate measures to prevent the causing of significant harm. So it's an obligation of conduct rather than an obligation of result. So a state has to show that it has taken all the appropriate measures. If, however, after taking all of these appropriate measures, harm is still caused, then in that case, there is a duty to consult with the harmed state in order to mitigate or eliminate the harm. So the article does not tell us what happens if a state does not fulfill its due diligence obligations. What happens if a state does not take all appropriate measures to prevent the causing of harm? And that is a particularly important question, because if I disregard the studies and I go ahead with constructing based on a fait accompli, then it is quite possible, if harm is caused at the end of the day, that this will be considered non-compliance with a due diligence obligation. Now I say that and with a caveat that we don't know whether this dam will result in harm to Egypt or not. As Dr. Wheeler just said, there are different risks and there are different probabilities to take into account. So I'm not passing judgment on whether harm will happen or not. But if there is a likelihood of harm, then it is absolutely essential to make sure that we invest in the studies and that we respect the outcome of the studies. And if the studies tell us that the dam needs to be changed in terms of design or size or capacity or structure or technology, then that is something that must be taken into consideration if we are to say that we have fulfilled our due diligence obligation. Now, the second part of the obligations under the Declaration of Principles is procedural. So I'm going to briefly look at Principle 5, the principle to cooperate on the first filling and operation of the dam. And this stipulates that the parties are to implement the recommendations of the IPOE and to respect the final outcomes of the joint studies. And this is to happen throughout the different phases of the project. So the language used here is clearly mandatory. So it's to implement the recommendations and respect the outcomes. And this is to happen throughout the different phases of the project. So this strongly suggests that the outcomes of the studies are supposed to indicate the different phases of construction and are supposed to inform construction of the dam. So to speed ahead with construction at a very aggressive pace without taking into consideration the studies in and of itself seems to be inconsistent with the text of Article 5. Now, having said that, Article 5 also has a second component which relates to the issue of filling. So the 3 countries have agreed that they will utilize the final outcomes in order to agree on a rule of first filling. And so the process is the studies the studies happen first, and then the parties agree on a rule of first filling, and then the first filling happens. So if it so happens at any point that construction reaches a very advanced stage, and then Ethiopia decides to fill without first reaching an agreement on first filling that is based on the studies, then that will be another violation of a procedural obligation. Now, we have to keep in mind that for various reasons, there were delays related to the studies. And these delays meant that the contracts were only signed last September, and we're talking about a process which is going to last many months. But this has to be taken into account by all of the parties if we are really going to be talking about good faith negotiations. Now, there's other agreements that are that we can look to for guidance in terms of what are the legal obligations of the parties. Unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about them, but there's the 2014 Malibu Statement, which says that the parties are, or that Ethiopia is to avoid any potential adverse effects on the GERD, of the GERD on the water uses of Egypt. Now, again, the binding nature of this statement has been contested, and there are arguments in favor and against. But the arguments in favor would say that this can either constitute a binding unilateral statement or similarly an agreement between the two states based on the same rationale as I mentioned earlier with the DOP. And then there's some more general agreements. There's the 1993 Framework for General Cooperation that talks about Ethiopia undertaking, or both parties undertaking, to refrain from engaging in any activity that may cause appreciable harm to the interests of one another. So both of these obligations are not due diligence obligations. They're obligations of result and not obligations of conduct. They place a clear obligation not to cause harm. One of them talks about appreciable harm and the other potential adverse effects. These are both a much lower threshold than significant harm. And then there's the 1902 Anglo-Ethiopian Treaty. And I put a question mark next to that on my PowerPoint because that is highly contested by Ethiopia. And I don't want to go into the legalities of why or why not this is binding, because it's such a long debate, and I would be happy to answer in the question and answer session. I just want to say that I'm very wary of calling this a colonial treaty. First of all, because Ethiopia was never a colony. And Ethiopia, when it signed this treaty, was an independent state. And this is a border agreement, and under international law, border agreements have a special status. So without looking at the precise text, if we look at the preparatory works, it is very easy to reconcile the interpretation of the 1902 treaty with modern international law. So interpretations that say the 1902 treaty absolutely prohibits Ethiopia from building a dam are not what anyone would really be looking at. So I'm going to leave this point unless someone has a question about it. And I just want to wrap up because I see we are running out of time. So I want to wrap up by asking the question, where to from here? And I just want to highlight a few things. That international law does not envision unilateral measures on a water course. So cooperation is key and cooperation is important, and it is indeed a very welcome development that downstream and upstream states in the Nile are cooperating. But again, I want to emphasize that the process of cooperation must be one that is inclusive, and it must not disregard the cooperative outcomes. The second point is we must make sure that all parties abide by their commitments under both procedural and substantive international law. The third point is that to have a true cooperative process based on good faith, it is essential that the pace of construction be stopped or at least slowed down in order to take account the studies. And that's where Dr. Wheeler's presentation comes in, and the importance of such a study and the science of how it is that we can coordinate between the interests that are upstream and that are downstream to make sure that the harm is minimized as far as possible. And then finally, perhaps a broader call on something that goes beyond the GERD, which is why not look at cooperative outcomes that involve a basin level approach. So maybe this could also be very useful. So taking into consideration all of the water that is available in the Nile Basin, including groundwater and surface water. And this is the approach that has been taken, for example, by the UNECE, the Regional Convention. So instead of talking only about the surface water of the Nile and how it is that we can reach cooperative outcomes when it comes to sharing the benefits of the surface water of the Nile, perhaps we should have a more comprehensive appreciation of all of the water resources in the Nile Basin. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, there's not much time to talk about anything else, but I'd like to leave it back to Scott and questions.
Well, thank you very much. That was a great introduction from the legal side, and I think brought out some of the more salient questions that a lot of people have. It sort of interfaces well with the more technical engineering side that we heard from Kevin Wheeler, but while at the same time reinforcing the issue that cooperation is key. So we are a little going over our time because we had such a great discussion, but we are happy to have some questions from the audience. If anyone has questions, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, you need to only go to the side of your GoTo control panel, GoTo webinar control panel that says questions down on the side. It's about 3 or 4 boxes down. Type your question. I will see it, and then I will direct it to our panelists. So please try to keep your questions kind of short, and my panelists, please try to keep your answers brief if you can. So please, if anyone has questions, please address them in that fashion. Type them in the question box, and I will see them, and then we can address them to our panelists. Maybe one question that we had that came from before the session, people were interested in asking. Sorry, a question just came in. I'm trying to read it. How does your studies? You know, you all come from kind of a more academic background. How does this interface with the legitimacy of politically represented, elected, and representative government? I mean, do you see yourselves as advisors, as consultants, or do you see yourselves as speaking with some authority and not knowledgeable authority, but literal authority, political power authority on these questions? How does our panel see your role here and our role as scholars of these questions? You may have to take yourself off mute if you've muted yourself.
I guess I can go ahead and start on that. So I mean, I've been both in a consulting role in the past, 4 different negotiations. In this role, it's strictly academic, and the focus, from my perspective, because we're not hired by the countries, is to provide ideas, to provide thought, to provide different approaches, knowing that nothing is binding. The countries can choose or not choose to absorb some of the ideas that we put out there. There is a process in place, and everybody we respect that process, and all of the scholars that are producing material are and should respect that process. However, the reality, as Dr. Moussa pointed out, it's a very short timeline for this, and the ability for the consultants to do this level of study will stress them a lot to be able to do the quantity of analysis that they have to do for such a complex topic. So we're hoping that some of the ideas that are generated would be welcomed by the consultants, but of course it's up to the countries themselves and the consultants in the countries that hire them to decide what ideas they take on board within their official documents.
Excellent. Thank you.
Perhaps I can also reply to the question very, very quickly. I would see these articles as academic pieces, analytical pieces that stand by themselves and do not represent a particular view or a particular institution. But I would say that in general, of course, that we all aim to influence the process somehow, I mean, to inform. I mean, from our point of view, is more at the institutional or political level, and what we try is to make the bridge between people like Kevin, for example, which is on more technical side, to the politicians, and we have policymakers that we prefer. Sometimes they don't like to be called politicians, so let's put it like policymakers. So to try to make the bridge, and I think a journal like this one allows that, allows to have this conversation.
If I can add to that, I agree, and I would say that I also want to emphasize that I'm talking in an academic capacity and not in any official capacity. And although similarly, I have had roles where I have given advice on certain issues, but currently this is in a purely academic capacity. And similarly, I think the role of academics is absolutely essential because without academics, unfortunately, a lot of the countries in the Nile basin do not have a lot of capacity, whether to carry out scientific research or legal research, or so it really is an issue of capacity and an issue of independent advice. Again, I think I would second what Anna said, is that there is a hope that it does influence policymakers.
Scott, I didn't listen. The questions, would you be able to repeat for me?
Yes.
I was not listening. What was going on for a while?
I understand. Just a question about how people see their role here, sort of within the science policy interface of, are we speaking today purely as academics? Are we speaking as hoping to address and drastically influence? Or are we hoping to speak as having some sort of actual political authority over the question, over the situation in the Nile?
Obviously, this is an academic endeavor. So basically, the articles are research-based and science-based, depending on the fields involved in the article authored in the special issue. But these are not abstract issues. Our main purpose is to help everyone concerned to understand the issues, to look at the various perspectives, various approaches to these questions, with the aim of making a positive impact on the ground. So I would say, as clearly stated in the editorial of the special issue, that policymakers will benefit from this. Certainly, we don't claim that we'll solve all the problems, but we'll be part of solving the problem. And again, there are different perspectives. There are various researches conducted on this topic, but this can serve among one of these research outcomes that can be used to inform policy, to inform negotiations on the ground. In that respect, we believe it can be very, very useful.
Excellent, thank you. Well, that's good, and I like hearing that from the editor to get your perspective as well. We have another question here from the audience, which asks, from Abner Yunus, what's a possibility, what are the chances of using international law to adopt the idea that Professor Wheeler has given of a risk management rather than this harm, no harm divide that typically comes out? What do our panelists think about that?
That's a question for the lawyers.
I must confess that I haven't made any legal presentation here. I haven't presented the paper on the article that we authored together with Alistair, Rieu-Clarke. But I would say that risk management must be part of the basic principles and subordinate rules of international water law. So when you talk about preventing significant harm upon a basin country, I think that must include everything. that must include the possible extent, if there is a political will from all sides, to manage the risks, to prevent the risks, to coordinate efforts to minimize any potential harm. And that seems to be the approach taken in these negotiations, in my view. So if you look at the negotiations going on in the Eastern Nile Basin, the Ethiopian side is saying that we don't have any intention to cause any harm on Egypt and Sudan. Rather, would like to share the benefits with them. And this doesn't emphasize on the notion of significant harm. But when we talk about the hard law, the rules of international water law, we have to put the notion of the duty to prevent significant harm within the context of, as rightly stated by Jasmine, within the context of the principle of equitable and reasonable use. So that is the cardinal principle. That's the primary principle. But it is also supported by the principle of the duty to prevent significant harm as it is subordinate. So I see it this way.
If I might add to that, I think there is a. Sorry, shall I go on?
Yes.
Yeah. I think there is a clear gap between science and law in this area. I think it's unfortunate because I find that the principles of equitable and reasonable use and no harm are quite vague, and sometimes they're not very useful. They're quite ill-defined, quite undeterminate, and I really believe that if law is to function as it should, then there should be some determinacy to these principles. So I'm definitely one of the critics of these principles in the way that they are currently articulated in the UN Watercourses Convention. Now, having said that, maybe I disagree somewhat with Zeray. I do not believe that equitable and reasonable use is the primary principle or takes priority over no significant harm. I believe that this was a progressive development aspect of the UN Watercourses Convention because clearly it was a package deal that was proposed in the negotiations on the UNWC, and it passed with a very, very slim majority. So I would say both principles exist under customary international law. The interaction between them is not very clear, but I would say that both principles take each other into consideration. So when we look at equitable and reasonable use and the factors that go into deciding what constitutes an equitable and reasonable use, again, we find notions of harm coming in, like taking into consideration existing and potential uses of a watercourse or the effect on other watercourse states. So there's a lot of principles and there's a lot of confusion. So I would say that international water law would benefit a lot from taking into consideration what scientific developments have to offer.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Professor Wheeler, was there anything you'd like to add to that, just based on maybe what you gathered, what your interactions, your consultations?
I recognize that it's a very difficult thing to include probabilistic thinking into writing legal documents. That's a challenge that we certainly would face. I worked on the U.S.-Mexico negotiations, and during that time it was very difficult to think of probability in those terms. But I think it's very critical because it's reality. It's a physical reality in a hydrologic system that there is there's never any certainty. We can talk about the increased the risk of harm versus the increased risk of harm, and those are two different things. And certainly, this is why I leave it to the smart lawyers to help define how this could actually be done. But I can say from an engineering point of view, there's really no way around acknowledging the probabilistic nature of a river.
Fair enough.
Well, can I intervene very briefly? Well, I agree the principles in the Water Courses Convention have some vagueness, and this is not unique to that aspect of international law. I think in international law or even domestic law, there is always some vagueness. But what happens is that these principles can be interpreted and can be practical in relation to specific cases. And the GERD is a good example, a concrete case on which these rules and subordinate principles can be applied, aided by scientific research. So the research that Kevin and his colleagues are doing, the research that other international experts are doing, can help to come up with the notion of fairness. At the end of the day, it's about applying fairness in the use of Nile waters, but also in the protection of the river and the ecosystem and the environment in general. And I agree that science and law are different, but on the other hand, they can be related if one has the good faith and the good intention to apply them in a spirit of cooperation. And my hope is that the parties to this case would be able to apply and rely on these principles, being supported by science, being supported by research, to come up with a reasonable way of applying these principles. And my other hope is that the countries won't rely on just studies conducted by foreign firms or whatever, rather than using them as an aid to come up with a reasonable and equitable solution to the problem. But I understand the tension between science and the legal principles.
Excellent. Well, we don't have too much time for too many more questions, but one that I think is particularly relevant here is that in all of our discussions, we've talked about law, we've talked about engineering, but very little has been talked about civil society. And one of our audience members would like anyone to be able to speak to at what point could or should the negotiation and the construction process start engaging with civil society groups, NGOs and the like, to sort of foster a culture, as they describe, of peace and cooperation in the basin area. Could any of our presenters speak to that?
Perhaps I can can try to reply to the question. I think it's an important one, of course. It looks like we are just talking about policymakers in one side, scientists in the other ones, and then builders as a third party. And of course, that's definitely not the case. The concept of civil society, I would turn the question to the person and ask what does that mean exactly. But understanding this as a process that should be wider and include more people and those affected. I mean, in the first place, of course, those affected by the dam in Ethiopia itself. And we can see this in a larger way, I mean, including the other civil societies of the other country, of Egypt and Sudan, which are parts which are also going to be affected in a way or another, if nothing else, by the reports that there will be high risks, I mean. And the kind of work that, for example, we do at CEWE is exactly that one. I mean, trying to bring other groups also to the discussion. And recently, we have done something, including one important part of the civil society, or that we consider, which is the media. And we brought the media from all the different 3 countries involved to try to understand, I mean, the perceptions of the public. Let's put it in the public discourse. How do they understand all these technical difficult issues and the legal issues, I suppose, that are difficult as well for a general public that doesn't have specific knowledge. So as much more inclusive as we can to bring them forward. And we can do this as like say, third parties and not necessarily being involved in the process, I think it's very important. But we cannot replace, of course, what the governments are doing themselves.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
I mean, a number of articles in the special issue strongly recommended a participatory process, and obviously this includes securing participation of citizens of the three countries. And at the end of the day, the dam will either positively or negatively have some implications for people. We are talking about human beings, either those who are suffering from extreme poverty or those who are engaged in agriculture or other activities who might be benefiting or might be affected by the dam. So at the end of the day, citizens must have a say, must have participation in the process, in the negotiations, in the decision-making process in particular, not necessarily in the negotiations, but in the negotiation, in the processes that feed into the negotiations and the decisions to be made by the negotiating parties. And I believe local communities and those civil societies that represent these local communities, or even civil societies that advance cooperation and protection of the natural environment, protection of the river itself, must be listened by policymakers. And this is also embraced in the notion of fairness. So when you talk about fairness, legitimacy, distributive justice, we talk about addressing the interests of different stakeholders, and not necessarily only states as the main actors of the negotiations.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Does anyone else have a comment on that, or we go to the next question? Okay. Well, I think we have time for one more question. And so this is kind of a two-part. I'm sort of combining some questions from a few different of our audience members. But first, are there any outside of the box question or ways to address water needs within the Nile Basin that maybe we aren't getting at through the construction of a large dam? So the audience member here suggests questions like desalinization, water harvesting, or other intra-basin transfers. I mean, perhaps our audience or our panelists can speak to what they've read, what they've heard about these kind of ideas as well. And then finally, also, have you seen other development projects in the basin between these countries which involve high levels of cooperation, but which the audience member would like to know about, which had negative impacts, unforeseen, drastic impacts? And I think the question here is really, why not try more cooperation? Is there any chance of? There seems to be little chance of something going awry. So, sort of, can our panelists speak to these two kind of questions? Outside of the box, what are our choices? What are some other options, if at all? And why not take a risk at further cooperation? And maybe within this kind of broader, open-ended question, you can sort of make your sort of final remarks. If you have any sort of final thoughts on the webinar and the discussion we've been having here, and we'll wrap this up with this final question. Who would like to go first?
I don't mind going first.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So thank you for both of those questions. I think with respect to the outside of the box question, I think that's really interesting, and I think there are a lot of initiatives that are being taken. So in Egypt, for example, that's the example that I am aware of. But maybe the other panelists know more about what's happening in other Nile Basin countries. So there is water recycling that takes place. So the water is recycled up to 5 and 6 and 7 times. So that's one way that water is being conserved and is being reused because water is quite scarce. Another issue is desalination, of course, and I think that there are all issues that are being planned and looked into. So I think that's definitely a really interesting and good suggestion, and I wish there were more resources available for this kind of development in all of the Nile Basin states. And I think that certainly would be something to try to decrease evaporation losses or to try to find alternative sources of water. These are all issues that would really help dissipate a lot of the conflict that happens over how to allocate uses of water. The other issue, further cooperation, I absolutely agree with that. I wish there could be further cooperation. I wish there could be more trust. I think that's one thing that is possibly lacking in the Nile Basin region to a certain extent. There has been a lack of trust, and there's a lot of, I think, a lot of very strong feelings about issues that happened in the past and about historical issues that give rise to a lack of trust currently. So further cooperation is definitely absolutely important. Investing in science, investing in studies that would shed light on how to maximize benefits and minimize harm as far as possible. I think that's all part of the way forward.
Great. Who next?
I can throw in a few things here. For out-of-the-box thinking, there's certainly a lot of ways that we can explore some of the groundwater issues that Jasmine mentioned. But one of the things that I would like to emphasize is the agriculture is the critical component for everyone in the basins, and the ability to transfer technology. Some of the good work that's been going on in Egypt, in parts of Egypt for their efficiency improvements, those things can be transferred to other parts of the basin within Egypt, and certainly to Ethiopia as well. So some of the communication and technology transfer for agricultural practices, it's in really everyone's best interest to increase efficiency in the system, both the ability for Ethiopia to harvest more rainwater for their own development, as well as Egypt to be more efficient in their uses. So I think that's where some of the out of the box thinking really has to happen, is in the agriculture sector. When it comes to some of the sort of unintended impacts of the treaties and agreements, I think one of the key things that needs to be emphasized is you don't have to solve everything at once, but short-term agreements can really be beneficial. And with a limited time frame, over a certain period of time, just a filling agreement, one comprehensive agreement to solve everything is not only very difficult, but it's often not possible, starting from such a challenging beginning point. So it's often helpful to start small and successful with something that everyone can agree on, and use that as a building block for the next opportunity. Better than trying something extremely large and trying to solve all the problems that could be much more subject to failure. But something small and successful, even with a limited time frame, can be the first step to avoiding these unintended consequences. That's all.
Excellent, thank you.
Maybe I can try to reply mainly to the first question, the out-of-box. Perhaps I think we should be very clear. This is not about water quantity. There is enough resources in the river basin, and talk about blue water, groundwater, green water, enough to be developed. The question is that what's on the ground now, how is being used? And I think this is part of the question that we perhaps try to ignore somehow, is that how water is being allocated at the moment and being used, and question if this is the best way of using the water resources. Then we go back again, thanks Kevin for pointing it out, that most of this water, most of the Nile water is being used in agriculture. and what type of agriculture, what is being produced. And I think we need to ask these questions when we think about out-of-the-box solutions, because that might lead to the current water use to something else, if not, well, perhaps still in the agriculture sector, but producing some other crops than are being produced nowadays. And I think perhaps the out-of-the-box to sort out some of these lingering, call it conflicts if you want, going on in the basin is nothing to do with increasing more or making available more water resources or water demand management. It has to do with the thinking, with the framework of thinking of countries. No, countries, they don't think, politicians do and take decisions. Thinking that should we be focused on the same issues that for the last 100 years we have been debating, or should we focus on other out-of-box type of process that could help people, could help countries to move on? A lot of attempts have been made with benefit sharing, with transboundary water cooperation. The NBA itself has been doing a lot of studies that explore these different types. So the problem is that how does this go from a nice idea to something that policymakers really engage with? I think that's the critical out-of-box type of thinking that we need.
Excellent. Well, thank you.
Can I respond to the second part of the questions of further cooperation? I agree with the comments about the need for further cooperation in the Eastern Nile Basin, based on modern thinking, modern principles that are widely accepted in the international community. And interestingly, this modern thinking and modern principles are now accepted by the key Nile Basin countries. I think this must be considered as a big achievement. And as we can see from the Declaration of Principles, I think the ambition of the parties is to go beyond the GERD, to work on integration issues around investment, around infrastructure, around maximizing their benefits from the river and outside the river. But all this require genuine engagement with this kind of momentum, genuine engagement and building upon the positive spirit that existed, that was created in March 2015, and also addressing the challenges that we have been talking about, to do with feeling, to do with studying, and using the studies and other things as an input rather than as a tool to blame one party against the other. So in my personal view, I think genuine engagement would be required to advance cooperation beyond the GERD, beyond this sub-basin, and take it the next level to make it basin level cooperation, and even a good opportunity for broader integration issues, broader cooperation issues.
Well, excellent. I appreciate those comments. And I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in today and joining our webinar. We've had a lot of really great discussion today, and I think we've had a lot of good exchange of ideas, respectfully, even if we haven't always had the same exact viewpoints. And I think that this kind of exchange of ideas sort of mirrors what we want to see in the development process itself, and in the construction process itself. Frank exchange of ideas and with respect for analysts, and hopefully with the point of leading somewhere towards getting some sort of agreement and actual understanding achieved. I want to thank all of our audience members for sticking with us here. We're about a half hour over our allocated time, and we appreciate you sticking around to listen to a few of our questions. And we think that, but that's a really great way to hear. I like to hear your ideas and to see this exchange. I want to remind everyone here today that the webinar is, as we discussed a few times, based on the special issue of our International Water Resources Association flagship journal, Water International, and it will also be the subject of a forthcoming policy brief of the same topic. So the entire journal issue shrank down into a few pages for those of you who are pressed for time. And all this will be available on our website, www.iwra.org, very soon. We will have the PowerPoint presentations from our presenters. We will hopefully have a recording of this session, and you can, from there, find links to go to the journal, which is behind a firewall, but if you're at a university or something, you can easily access that, or the policy brief, which will also be available there. I'd like to remind you also that the International Water Resources Association is a nonprofit, non-governmental educational group. We're over 40 years old, and we work on bridging these disciplines and geographies and connecting all the different professionals, students, individuals, corporations, and institutions who are interested and concerned with sustainable use of the world's water resources. We are a membership organization, so if you like what you've heard here, please go to our website and find out more information on becoming a member and joining with us so that you can have access to our journal, access to more of our webinars, access to more of our network of professionals, like-minded individuals. I remind you all that we also have operate the World Water Congress. We're the sponsors of this, and the next one will be held in Mexico in 2017. The call for abstracts is now open, so if you are interested in submitting an abstract for discussion at this World Water Congress, you should go to our website and get more information there. And if you have any more questions about anything that the International Water Resources Association does, please just go to www.iwra.org, and we'd like to be able to connect with you and help you understand more about what we do. So thank you to everyone for viewing. Thank you to all of my panelists for patiently and sticking with us to the end here. And really appreciate your contributions. Thank you so much for everything you've done. And I hope that everyone has a great day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.